For the past several seasons, I've started a new gardening ritual to get out in early spring as soon as I can work the ground and go about planting peas. This marks the beginning of my planting calendar, setting the stage for a bountiful year. Usually my ground blankets itself with voluntary vines and plants that brave through winter's cold, pumping out green leaves amongst brown and gray desiccated plant matter. These green blankets, called weeds by most, can get annoying to anyone who doesn't want to stop a bit to observe the rhythms of nature. They serve the most important function of keeping the soil food web productive during the most inhospitable months of the year, ensuring an explosion of fertility and green growth come spring. Watching this yearly spectacle of green growth around March and April in this temperate climate has always fascinated me, since the first year I experienced real distinct seasons like those here in Maryland. Growing up in the tropics, I was accustomed to green all around all the time, growing pretty much with the same intensity always. Green things seemed more stationary there, as there was always just one leaf growing and another one falling. The contrast of winter and summer here emphasized the cycles of life and death. That way, when plant springs to life, there is no missing the show. I was clearing the soil to plant peas, something that all seed packets and gardening books advise should be done as early as the ground can be worked. That is because peas can tolerate a few frosts as they start sprouting, so there is no need to ensure frost-free conditions when starting them. I got some old branches of evergreens to spread as a protective layer of mulch over the freshly uncovered earth. I planned to sow the peas the next day, but I wanted the soil to stay covered to discourage the growth of other involuntary plants as well as protect the soil life from the elements. I have found that this fine mulch is great to use when planting seeds directly on the ground, expecting them to germinate. A fine mulch will make it easier for seeds to find light and will at the same time protect them from drying wind and sun. These branches of evergreen had been discarded, so I had collected them to first use as insulation around my experimental cold frames. Indeed, they had helped keep the temperatures warmer inside the cold frames. They were even starting to break down, which to me was indicative of composting going on. Now that the worst of winter was past, I had to repurpose these branches into something useful. Mulch seemed like the perfect idea, so I went about testing it out. With the ground ready to be planted, I went inside to prime the pea seeds by soaking them in water. Not all seeds need to be primed to germinate well. Some seeds like radish or lettuce germinate easily when planted directly in the ground and don't need much assistance in that process, but usually larger seeds with a tougher seed coat will benefit from this practice. I had saved some seed from last year's pea crop that had produced really well. They were actually the pods I ended up not seeing during harvest time, and they had dried up on the plant by the time I was pulling up the vines to plant something else in their place. I was not too confident in their drying since there were some mold spots on the dried up shells, but they looked okay once opened, so I stored them in a paper envelope to use this season. I dropped half of them in a jar filled with water to allow them to soak the moisture and plump up overnight. The other half I decided to use the plate germination method with a moist paper towel inside a plastic bag. I would plant them out once the roots emerged, and that way I could test which method gave fastest results. Since they were starting on the same day, the only different conditions would be the temperatures before germination, since I would keep the plate indoors until they started to sprout. The next day, the seeds had plumped up in their jar and were ready to be planted. Since I had already prepared the soil, this was going to be an easy process. Temperatures had been all over this year, but they seemed to be in a warming trend. They usually prefer cooler temperatures and are prone to stop pumping out flowers and pods and start drying out as soon as summer heat starts. I drained the water from the jar and created shallow trenches to drop in pea seeds every inch or so. I tried to disturb the soil as little as I could, using a hori-hori tool that is very versatile. I brushed the mulch aside, uncovering the earth so I could plant directly on the soil without mixing mulch with soil. Peas marked the start of my growing season because they are the earliest vegetable I can venture to plant when there are still frosts visiting the garden at night. Peas were not part of my gardening repertoire, only because I felt that they were too complicated to grow for little reward, since peas can be bought cheaply, either canned or frozen. Since I didn't use the leaves, it seemed like I had to grow a lot of plant to get a small pod with 3 or 4 peas. All those assumptions turned out to be slightly incorrect. While they can be finicky when growing, especially in warm climates, if you grow them when it's cold, they thrive. It is just that we are not used to growing things that early. But the real change of heart for me came in trying a freshly picked garden pea for the first time. You cannot compare them to what you buy in stores. Canned ones or even frozen ones can never capture that flavor. I had extra seeds, so I decided to drop the remaining ones inside the cold frame where kale and arugula were growing. The idea was to have the peas germinate as soon as the salad greens became too big. But I was not counting on it, and something about these seeds, the way they had been saved in the mold spots and the outer husks when I collected them, did not sit well. I decided to be optimistic still. A couple days later, the peas in the plate were germinating, ready to be planted. There's something really odd about these seeds. Although they've sprouted, they developed some kind of a mold on top, but they still have the sprouts growing, so let's see how that works. I suppose it was the way they were dried or not dried enough when I was saving the seeds. I'll plant them and see what happens. And that's the thing about gardeners. We seem to have detached optimism. We plant seeds precisely because we hope them to grow, to produce and feed us. When we are beginners, we fully expect all of them to grow spectacularly, to show no signs of stress or disease, and produce abundantly. Of course, such expectations rarely come to fruition. Perhaps it is a good thing that we fail, and as beginners we often fail spectacularly. Who has not overwatered precious houseplants when seeing signs of wilted leaves, only to see more wilting? We at first fail to realize that they are wilting precisely because we overwater them. Who has not at first planted their vegetable garden beneath the shade of a tree because that was the best spot available, only to be disappointed by little fruit? Failure builds character. It teaches humility in a way that success, and even worse, permanent success, never does. By failing, we empathize with those who struggle. We recognize that our will to control is not supreme. We recognize that we are humans, and we see the humanity in others who may be in a worse off situation. Failure is a great school for empathy, and those who have only known success because it has been given them in a silver platter will never fully understand the concept. But gardening also breeds success. What is more generous and abundant than one seed of sunflower producing hundreds? There are things we can do to facilitate that success, but ultimately, when a tomato produces profusely, it is not because of our own merit, but because we were blessed to participate and observe, and maybe even meddle with the magical art of growing that only the tomato knows how to do when met with the right amount of sun and light and rain and soil life networks. Because even the tomato doesn't do it because of its own merit. It is a product of a collaboration, a symbiosis of factors in harmony. It is only when we come to terms with this condition that nothing lives in isolation, that we depend on others and others depend on us, that is when we practice this universal law. As gardeners, we have detached optimism because we always hope for the best and plan and act to have the best of results. But we know that things do go wrong and off plan. We never let those things discourage us, at least not for long. Dropping the seed in the soil is an act of faith. I was hoping these peas would grow and thrive, but all I could do was hope. Being a seasoned gardener, that was more than enough for me.